Hello, part 5, and here's where the wheels start coming down. So this is .NET Core Application, part 5, and in this part, if you've been following all along, I created this thing called donation materials, which is basically something that you can donate. Now, we want to actually put in together a donation request. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate foreign keys and customization here, and it's pretty cool stuff. So in donation request is going to say that I can have a user request some donation materials and another user can come in and fulfill that donation request. So I've already built the data model, and here's the model. Now there's going to be a foreign key, so I'm going to have, first thing I'm going to do is the donation request is going to have an ID. That's the ID field. Okay, primary key works pretty well. Then this part right here is how I define the foreign key. Now, the donation request is going to have one donation material that goes with the request. And I've got this, so there's two pieces. One is the int to the donation materials ID. The other one is this public donation materials where it links over to it. And that's one of the parts that you got to have to build that foreign key. Then I've got other things here that are important, like how many do you want? But there's other two things that I'm going to have important that are right here are, first, who made the request? So that's the request made by user ID, and the request fulfilled by user ID. So I'm going to have two user IDs that are going to be doing it, and those are strings because I'm going to use the ASP.NET user ID, which, by the way, is in another table, so I didn't make those explicitly a foreign key because not on another table, they're in another database altogether. But I want to put that information in, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And then I've actually got the date requested and the date fulfilled in here, which demonstrates a little bit of using the public date time fields as you go along. Okay, that's all part of the data model, but the data model follows the business logic of what I'm doing here. I've got donation materials and I've got a donation request, and then the request, you can request materials and you can fulfill that specific request. Okay, the next step that I did is I actually scaffolded out the request. So I have this, I went down here into pages, I created a namespace for request materials, and then I scaffolded it just like I did before. I'm not going to scaffold it again because I've made changes to the scaffolding and I wanted to show you the changes, but I didn't want you to have to go through all the steps of looking at those changes. But I did a standard Razor page using CRUD, and I built the base pages here. All right. I also have, I'm going to go over to the database. I have an ID. I have a user that I've created because I have to log in to demonstrate how this is going to work. Because I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to do the request materials. I've created some donation materials, and I can show you how that's actually going to work for request. And then once that is built, you can see, okay, so what I did was created a model. The model has a foreign key. Now, for this foreign key to work, I've actually got to show you another piece because it is part of donation materials is part of it. So I need to go to the data model for donation materials. If I bring the donation materials up here, I can show you that I created a list. Now that's going to let me, I don't have to, okay, so there's multiple ways to do this and create those foreign keys. But what I want to be able to do in here is I want to be able to, from a set of donation materials, go back and see what requests correspond with those donation materials. So to do that, I've added to donation materials that specific list. Now, to know the different ways to create foreign keys, you can go and look at the documentation because there's good documentation on how to do this. Now, you may want to create a foreign key. You may not want to create a foreign key. In this case, over here, I'll go over to the database. I have a donation materials ID foreign key in donation request because I want to make sure that you've requested materials that actually exist in the donation materials table. And it's going to be a one-to-many relationship, but reality is that a donation request is only really going to point at one donation material. So now you can actually, I created this thing in the model under donation request that you can request multiple requested item quantity, but it's of the same material. So whatever is in there in the donation materials, you can say, I want that, I want this many of it. Now, once that is done, once you've created that, you've got the ability to go ahead and scaffold. I've scaffolded out, but I'm going to show you some neat tricks with scaffolding. But you need to do a migration. When I scaffolded, I put I use the context of Grief Heroes. So if I go to Grief Heroes context, the DB set corresponding with the donation request is in there. That's all it did. It created a DB set in the Grief Heroes context corresponding with the model donation request. Got it? And the donation request is the model that I created. I know it looks a little bit confusing, but I want you to understand that you create a model. You define the model ahead of time. You don't do it while you're coding. The model is a piece of data that you're going to keep track of in your application. Once you do that, create that model, you can actually add it to the Grief Heroes context without scaffolding any pages. I scaffolded some pages because I'm going to show some customization to those scaffolded pages that I want to do. I'm actually going to do scaffolding multiple times with this application because I get different ways of dealing with the request materials. And the reason is that one person's going to go in and request stuff, and another person's going to go in and fulfill the request, and they're both going to go into the same table. I'm going to update the table with the information from that from the fulfillment that's made on the request. But first I'm going to show you how all that's going to work, how we're going to do the request itself. Got it? Now, and that's kind of neat. So I'm still going to add a migration because I want to create the table. And I don't need to do it when I create the request and the fulfillment. I'm going to do it once. So I add a migration that takes Grief Heroes context, and then I update the database with that context. Let's go to the database and see what happened. Here's donation request. It has its ID. It's got a foreign key to donation materials ID, and it's got the other pieces. Note that the made by user ID and the request fulfilled by user ID in this case are not foreign keys, because in my logic, the actual users aren't even in the same database. They're in another database, and that's the database that I customize with this information. I am going to have some logic that deals with if those users don't exist. But for right now, I'm making the assumption that those users do exist. So then what did I do? I'm going to have this ability to request materials. I'm going to do some customization. Now let's look at this create in request materials. Okay, once I scaffolded this, what I did here, and I know it's very difficult to see a little bit of this, but I can actually pull this down a bit because you can see that I went ahead and ran package manager and I created an updated, I created a migration and I updated the database. I commented out a bunch of the code. And this is the code that actually displays all those fields. And the reason is simple. First, the request made by user ID, okay, if you're requesting it, I'm not going to have you enter that. I'm going to get that from the fact that you're logged in. And it's going to just pull that. I'm going to show you how to do it, by the way. Request fulfilled by, and the fulfilled by user ID is going to go away too. But in this case, the request fulfilled by user ID is never even going to get entered into the system. It's not a required field because you're not fulfilling it. You're requesting it. And so that's going to be, it's going to stay blank. I'm not going to have a fulfillment statement. I'm not going to, now the date requested, that's going to be today. That's going to be the day that they actually click on that. So the date requested is going to be done in code, okay? and the date fulfilled, well, you're not fulfilling it, so that doesn't even go in there. And then I've got the other pieces. Now, where do you actually do this? Okay, so I'm going in now, I'm going to modify code. So let's go into the CS HTML piece and look at this. Now, what I did here was I did put a bunch of, I put some stops in here so you can see what actually happens when you run this. And we're going to run it, and I'm going to show you this. But right here is where I've started adding code. I've got string ID, and I actually go ahead and get the ID of the user from the system because I'm going to set donation request made by user ID equal to that ID so that when I actually make a request, it's going to take the user ID of the user that's logged in and use that ID because the user's not going to know their ID. They're not going to enter it. Okay, so let's run it. Okay, so if I start this up and I look at this, and I'm going to have to actually do some little tweaking to get you to the right pages. But the first thing that I'm going to do here when I'm running this code is I am going to, and see, here's the code. Okay, here it is over here. And I should, okay, that's not what I want. I want it to, all right, it should be running. There we go. All right, so here I am. I'm going to go ahead and log in. I got my login information. Now, one of the things that I haven't done is connect to database. When by default, when you're to log in, you have to be able to use the login, you actually have to have an email sent and validation done. Well, I can change that, but I need to show you that there is a way to fix that. If you go into the table for ASP.NET users that you've created, and you right-click on the table, ASP.NET users, and you do edit, top 200 rows. Over here where it says email confirmed, you can change that false to true, and then it will let you log in. I've already logged in here. Now, I don't have any links to the pages that actually allow you to create a request materials, but now I'm going to go ahead and bring that page up. Now, what's going to happen, however, is because I've got breakpoints set here, I wanted to show you what's happening. In the create for that specific page, this is code that's actually there. And I'm going to go ahead and show you that it's going to get the ID of the donation materials, ID. It's going to go to a page, and the view data is just basically it's getting information. This can be modified, okay? We're going to use this later on. We're not using it right now. And then it returns the page. And when it returns the page, it goes to the page, and here's the page that gets returned. Now, if I go ahead and say I want to enter 1 and the request fulfilled, I'm not going to enter true there, but I can actually enter a statement here. And I'm going to click now on create. Here's what's going to happen. Okay, now I've got a code stop here at the model state is valid. Right now the model state is not valid. Okay, and you can actually go in here is valid and see that it's false because there actually are fields that I needed to enter to get it valid, and so it's not going to enter anything into the database, which is right down here on the context donation request, add donation request. It's never going to get there, but I can make the model state valid by entering the correct data to make it valid. One of the pieces of information to make it valid is the ID. This is the ID of me, the currently logged in user, okay, by using the user, find first, system.security.claims.claim types, name identifier, value. There is the magic code to get the ID of the currently logged in user. Then I set, okay, the model is donation request, and I set the request made by user ID equal to that ID. So now that is going to get into the donation request. So if I looked at what the donation request has, it now has that field entered. What I don't have entered is the date, which I can do. I'm going to add code to do that, and I'll post that code up. I don't need to go through all the pieces of code to show what I'm adding to the model as I go along. What I need to show you is that on post async, in that where I'm actually going ahead and posting it and making where I'm posting the data to the database, I can enter in code the fields that I want to do in code. And those are fields that I commented out. Now, I could have created it from scratch, but I didn't create it from scratch. I created it from scaffolding, and when I created it from scaffolding, I scaffolded the entire table. And then I commented out a whole bunch of the stuff that was in the model/table, because I'm going to actually do a lot of that from code, and that code's going to live here. Now, when I use the when I create migrations, and if I went back and rescaffolded it, I'd lose all this code. So be very careful when you do that. But now I'm in the customization side of customizing those pages so that they do exactly what I want them to do. So what do I want them to do? When the user clicks create and it calls on post async, I want to get the ID of the current user, which I did right here. I want to set that into the model to the correct field in the model to be equal to that ID. And when it checks the model state valid, which it isn't right now, but I've got to add, that's because I haven't added all the required fields to bring the model state into validity. But when I do, and I add all those other things in there, it's going to skip the return page, and it's going to go in here, and it's going to set the, it's going to go ahead and add the donation request into the context, and it's going to it's going to go to the await/context save page, changes as async, and it's going to read it right back to the index. Now, here, when the model state is not valid and it returns the page. Now, in this case, the return to the page makes sense because the validation that would normally occur in this part, because it does have an ASP validation for all these things, the validation that would normally occur here would show you that, oh, you just didn't enter something that needed to be entered. Okay, but I also want to show you that you don't necessarily have to return back to the page. You've got control of that code, so you can go somewhere else. I know this is a lot, but it's really not that complex. Okay, I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to go through very quickly what I did. First, I created another model based on my application logic. Okay, I called it donation request. I called it donation request because the application logic is to allow users to request a donation and other users to fulfill a donation. Okay, simple. I put in some information about that. I followed the guidelines like the primary key. If you make the first field ID, it's going to automatically say, I think that's the primary key, and set it to the primary key. Then I had some other pieces. Now, one of the fields that's required donation materials ID, because you got to pick, you can only pick donation materials from the, you can only request materials that actually exist in donation materials, because otherwise you'd be requesting nothing. Okay, we don't know what it is, because the donation material is not in the donation request. Then I had other things like who made the request, who fulfilled the request, statements on both sides, and the dates that it all occurred. I scaffolded out a page for me to build pages for requesting those materials. I'm going to scaffold out another one to donate the materials, but I scaffolded them on the incomplete model because my intention was to save myself time, then comment out what I didn't want. All right, I have the model. I put the model together. Note that when I put this foreign key in there, I also had to make a change to donation materials to make sure that you could actually do it as a foreign key, because I also want to be able to look backwards, okay, at donation requests from this. There is documentation on how to do both, with that or without that, in the Microsoft documentation. I might put together some lectures on how to do those with practical examples if I have that. Then I scaffolded out in a file folder that is not called the same name as the model, because I already know that that causes problems, and I've got to create, delete, details, edit, and index in here. Those are all created. I went into create. I commented out the fields that I didn't want for to show on the screen, and then I showed you how to go into the CSHTML file behind that and make changes, and also how to go ahead and stop by running breakpoints and see what was going on, so that you can actually look at what's happening along the way as you're executing this and debugging it. I know that is a lot, but it is all stuff that you really want to learn how to do. Good programming, this is part 5. There is more to come.